This lecture is about the naval battles of Guadalcanal that complement my 5-part series on the land battles of Guadalcanal, all of which can be found on my YouTube channel page. This is a map of the Pacific Theater of Operation in 1942. The naval battles that I will describe took place within this circle. This map indicates the location of the Solomon Islands and their proximity to the islands and surrounding seas where these battles took place, including the Santa Cruz Islands, Espiritu Santo in the New Hebrides, and the Japanese naval base at Rabaul. These are the islands that make up the Solomon Archipelago. Guadalcanal is in the southern Solomons. The Japanese brought reinforcements and supplies down from their large base at Rabaul to Guadalcanal through what came to be known as the Slot. This is a map of Guadalcanal and the geographical points relevant to the naval battles fought in and around Savo Sound, what later would be called Iron Bottom Sound. At the end of July, senior Japanese commanders held a conference at Truk, headquarters of the Southeast Area Force. The Southeast Area Force consisted of the IJN 8th Fleet, headquartered at Rabaul under the command of Rear Admiral Mikawa, the IJA 17th Army, also at Rabaul under the command of Lieutenant General Hyakutake, and the IJN 11th Air Fleet under the command of Vice Admiral Tsukahara. Throughout the critical early weeks of the Guadalcanal campaign, the commanders of the 17th Army were mostly concerned with the ongoing fight for Port Moresby along the Kokoda Track on the Papuan Peninsula and had, according to high-ranking Japanese naval officers, absolutely no concern for the Solomons. The battle for Guadalcanal featured tight interdependence among the three services of the air, land, and sea. For the Marine riflemen to seize and hold the island, ships of the fleet had to control the seas around it. For the fleet to control the seas, the Navy and Marine pilots had to fly from Henderson Field. For the pilots to fly from Henderson Field, the Marine riflemen had to hold the perimeter around the airfield. This three-legged footstool stood only by the strength of all three legs. In the end, according to James Hornfisher in his seminal book, Neptune's Inferno, it was principally a Navy's battle to win. Before describing the naval battles of Guadalcanal, I first want to describe the United States Navy command structure for Operation Watchtower, the first offensive in the Pacific War. Fleet Admiral Ernest King, who was the force behind the plan to draw a line in the sand at Guadalcanal, was Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Fleet and Chief of Naval Operations, stationed in Washington, D.C. Admiral Chester Nimitz was Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, SINCPAC, stationed at Pearl Harbor. Vice Admiral Robert Gormley was Commander, South Pacific Forces, stationed in Noumea, New Caledonia. Gormley was later replaced by Vice Admiral William Halsey. Vice Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher commanded the Expeditionary Force and was in overall command of Operation Watchtower. Rear Admiral John S. McCain commanded Task Force 63, the naval land-based aircraft forces. As mentioned, Admiral Fletcher commanded the Expeditionary Force. Vice Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner commanded the Amphibious Forces, Task Force 62. Rear Admiral Lee Noyes commanded the Air Support Force, Task Force 61. Major General Alexander Vandergrift commanded the landing forces of the 1st Marine Division. Rear Admiral Victor Crutchley of the Royal Australian Navy commanded the Cruiser Covering Force, Task Force 44. Vice Admiral Fletcher commanded Task Force 11 with his flag aboard USS Saratoga. Rear Admiral Thomas Kincaid commanded Task Force 16 with his flag aboard USS Enterprise. Rear Admiral Lee Noyes commanded Task Force 18 with his flag aboard USS Wasp. The Japanese were quick to respond to the Marine invasion. That afternoon, Betty bombers, Val dive bombers, and Zero fighters, 57 planes in total from Rabaul, came swooping down on the ships of Task Force 62. Having been alerted to the incoming attack by coast watchers, the Navy was ready. Fighters from the carriers were waiting for them and shot down most of the attackers. The only Allied ship damaged was a destroyer, hit by a bomb that killed 19 sailors. At noon the next day, the Japanese sent down another attack force. Once again, given the advance warning from an alert coast watcher, the transports and their screen were maneuvering at battle speed when the air attack arrived. The cruisers put up a terrific amount of anti-aircraft fire and shot down most of the planes. The Japanese managed to place a torpedo into the Jarvis, which was eventually sunk later as it limped away. The transport George F. Elliott was crashed by a damaged Betty. It was later scuttled off the shore of Tulagi. Once the Marines had established a defensive perimeter around the airfield, soon to be renamed Henderson Field, the transports arrayed themselves as indicated in this map. As the sun began to set on August 8th, Task Force 62 reconfigured itself to confront the night. The carriers withdrew to their night patrol area south of Guadalcanal, out of range of Japanese land-based aircraft. At 1830 hours, Admiral Crutchley ordered his heavy cruisers to take station guarding the two avenues of approach to Savo Sound, soon to be renamed Iron Bottom Sound, on each side of Savo Island. These defensive dispositions would guard against a Japanese incursion from the northwest and from the east. The northern patrol force, including the heavy cruisers Vincennes, Quincy, and Astoria, escorted by 3 destroyers, patrolled the entrance east of Savo Island. The southern patrol force, consisting of cruisers Chicago, HMAS Australia, and Canberra, guarded the approach southwest of Savo. The route into the Sound from the east was defended by San Juan and Australian light cruiser Hobart and 2 destroyers. The destroyers Blue and Ralph Talbot patrolled north and west of Savo Island as early warning radar pickets. With the loss of Lexington in the Battle of the Coral Sea and the Yorktown at Midway fresh in his mind, on August 8th, Admiral Fletcher made one of the most controversial decisions of the war. To protect the carriers of Task Force 61, providing Task Force 62's umbrella and shield, he announced that he was pulling his carriers out earlier than planned. This infuriated Admiral Turner, commanding Task Force 62, but because Fletcher was the ranking officer of the expeditionary force, his decision was final. The amphibious commanders met on the evening of August 8th to discuss what to do on learning the news of losing the carriers and their umbrella of fighter protection. Admiral Turner summoned General Vandergrift and Admiral Crutchley to his flagship Macaulay. Because of the loss of the carriers, he too would pull out the cruiser screen in a day or two. As these commanders took leave of Turner's flagship, Japanese torpedoes were already in the water. The Battle of Savo Island was about to begin. Rear Admiral Kunichi Mikawa commanded the Japanese 8th Fleet stationed at Rabaul. Within 3 hours of the invasion, Admiral Mikawa ordered a cruiser squadron to run south and strike the U.S. invasion fleet. His force sailed from Kevying, New Ireland, out of reach of air attack. He timed his departure, route, and speed to hit the invasion fleet at night. The Japanese were particularly skilled at fighting at night. This is the route he would take. These are the ships of Mikawa's attack force. It included 5 heavy cruisers led by Mikawa himself with his flag aboard Chokai. Behind them were 2 light cruisers and 1 destroyer. Along the way, Mikawa's force had been spotted by Australian reconnaissance planes and an American submarine, but this information, when relayed to Admiral Turner, was dismissed. Nobody gave serious consideration to a Japanese attack that night. I have covered the details of the Battle of Savo Island in a previous lecture on the Battle of Guadalcanal. Essentially, Mikawa came down the slot during August 8th and arrived at Savo Island just after midnight on August 9th. His ship sailed in a counterclockwise direction around Savo Island, split into two groups on the east side of the island, and eviscerated the Allied cruisers with torpedoes and naval gunfire before continuing back north. The only saving grace that night was that Mikawa failed to follow up his victory and destroy the now unprotected transports that lay naked to attack. He wanted to depart the scene before daylight, when he would be exposed to the wrath of U.S. carrier fighters and dive bombers. That night, the Allies suffered their worst naval defeat. They lost 4 heavy cruisers sunk, while the Chicago suffered heavy damage and 2 destroyers damaged. The Allies lost over 1,000 KIA. The Japanese suffered 2 heavy cruisers damaged, 1 light cruiser damaged, and 58 KIA. It was a resounding tactical victory for the Imperial Japanese Navy, but not a strategic victory. When news of the disaster filtered down to the marine perimeter that morning, unloading of the cargo ships accelerated at a frantic pace. Admiral Turner's plan was to withdraw his transport and cargo ships on August 9th, getting underway at first light. Already they were unprotected by the carrier planes of Task Force 61. Now their cruiser screening force had been wiped out. As the sun rose, Task Force 62 steamed eastward out of Iron Bottom Sound. The amphibious force, unloaded to the degree possible, also got underway for Noumea. The Marines were alone at Lunga Point and on Tulagi, at the mercy of Japanese land-based bombers and fighters and naval bombardment. The 1st Marine Division started referring to themselves as the 1st Marooned Division. Admiral Turner planned weekly convoys from Noumea to keep them supplied. Running convoys without air cover would be an unavoidable risk. Admiral King was awakened early in the morning and given the news of the losses at Savo Island. He was crushed. He later said it was the blackest day of the war. The route from Noumea to Guadalcanal had an important waypoint in the New Hebrides at the base of Espiritu Santo, about 622 miles closer to Henderson Field. Admiral Gormley, Commander-in-Chief of the South Pacific area, designated it as a strong point for the support and reinforcement effort. Base development began immediately. Eventually, the bustling base was equipped with 3 bomber airfields, repair dry docks, a PT boat base, and all the other needs of a major supply base. The central focus of this base was the supply and reinforcement of the Marines on Guadalcanal. Here are some photos of the advanced base at Espiritu Santo with facilities for an anchorage and the airstrips. On August 12th, a Catalina PBY was the first plane to land at Henderson Field. The pilot declared the unimproved airstrip fit to receive fighters. Without carrier aircraft to cover them, and with the base at Espiritu Santo just an idea, the Marines on Guadalcanal would have to establish their own air corps to defend themselves. It would soon be known as the Cactus Air Force. Cactus was the code name for Guadalcanal. On August 20th, the first planes of the Cactus Air Force landed at Henderson Field. They were brought to Guadalcanal aboard the escort carrier USS Long Island that had sailed from Fiji. 2 squadrons of Marine pilots ferried the planes from 200 miles out to Henderson. The first planes of the Cactus Air Force included 19 Wildcats and 12 SBD Dauntless dive bombers. With tears in his eyes, General Vandegrift greeted Major Richard Mangrum of Marine Bomber Squadron 232, saying, "Thank God you have come." The IJA made its first run of what later would become known as the Tokyo Express, Japanese attempts to reinforce their garrison on Guadalcanal the day after the planes arrived. The Tokyo Express would become an almost nightly attempt to bring down from Rabaul supplies and reinforcements. The first such attempt took place on August 19th, when Admiral Tanaka delivered under cover of darkness 900 men of the Ichiki detachment. They went ashore at Taivu Point, about 18 miles east of the marine perimeter. IJA Hubris played a big role in the Marine defeat of Ichiki in the Battle of the Tenaru, in which the Marines wiped out nearly the entire Ichiki detachment, including Ichiki himself. Admiral Yamamoto, who had his flag aboard IJN Yamato at Truk, was slow to react to the Marine invasion of Guadalcanal and Tulagi. He ordered the IJA and the IJN to prepare forces for a counterattack with the goal of driving the Marines off Guadalcanal and Tulagi. Yamamoto's primary objective was the destruction of the U.S. Navy warships in the South Pacific area, especially the carriers. His secondary objective in this operation was to get a small convoy of transports to Guadalcanal, including the late Colonel Ichiki's second echelon of the IJA 28th Infantry Regiment and several hundred special naval landing forces. This convoy would be escorted by 4 heavy cruisers under the command of Admiral Tanaka. These men were to be offloaded at Tassafaronga on the coast northwest of the marine perimeter. This convoy would be escorted by 4 heavy cruisers under the command of Admiral Mikawa. A further mission of these cruisers was to shell Henderson Field during the night of August 24th. Tanaka planned to land his forces on August 24th. This was the Japanese plan. On August 21st, Yamamoto's fleet departed Truk, heading for the southern Solomons. The main body consisted of the IJN fleet carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku and light carrier Ryujo. The vanguard force consisted of 2 battleships escorted by cruisers and destroyers. The advance force consisted of heavy cruisers, 1 light cruiser, and destroyers. Upon hearing of the attack by Ichiki on August 21st and pleas from General Vandergrift to send help, Admiral Fletcher turned the carriers of Task Force 61 north toward Guadalcanal and raced the 400 miles toward Henderson Field. Fletcher had been made aware from intelligence at Pearl Harbor of a possible IJN move toward Guadalcanal. He told the commanders of the other 2 carriers that they would launch a strike if he received word that the Japanese warships were in position or moving into position to bomb the airfield. Locating the enemy carriers was always a first objective. Each side sent aloft scout planes to try and find them. On August 23rd, none of the American scouts had located the Japanese fleet. Concluding that battle was not imminent, Admiral Fletcher ordered the Wasp to proceed south out of range of Japanese land-based bombers to refuel. This would deprive the Americans of 63 aircraft of a well-trained air group and, according to Richard Frank, the best chance in 1942 for the United States Navy to have potentially decisive quantitative superiority in a carrier action. Admiral Fletcher would go into battle with only the Saratoga and Enterprise. This map indicates the relative positions of the 2 fleets on the eve of battle. The ships are not to scale. Enterprise was screened by the battleship North Carolina, heavy cruiser Portland, anti-aircraft cruiser Atlanta, and 6 destroyers. These ships were arranged around Enterprise in the center of a protective circle 4,000 yards in diameter. Fletcher's second carrier, Saratoga, was screened by heavy cruisers New Orleans, Minneapolis, and 5 destroyers. Yamamoto's plan dictated that once the U.S. carriers were located, the Japanese carriers, under the command of Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, would immediately launch a strike to destroy them. With the U.S. carriers destroyed or disabled, the ships of the vanguard and advance forces would close with and destroy the remaining U.S. naval forces in a surface action. This would allow the Japanese to neutralize Henderson Field through bombardment while covering the landing of Japanese Army troops to retake Guadalcanal and Tulagi. The ensuing naval battle would go down in history as the Battle of Santa Cruz. Neither side had a firm idea where the other side's carriers were. Fletcher and his 2 carriers were steaming about 250 miles southeast of Guadalcanal, staying beyond range of Japanese planes. The Japanese strike force was moving south. At 01:45 on August 24th, Admiral Nagumo ordered Rear Admiral Tameichi Hara, commanding the light carrier Ryujo, heavy cruiser Tone, and 2 destroyers, to proceed ahead of the main Japanese force and send an aircraft attack force against Henderson Field at daybreak. Some historians believe this mission by Nagumo may have been a feint maneuver to divert U.S. Navy attention, allowing the rest of the Japanese force, including his carriers, to approach the U.S. naval forces undetected. At 09:35, a Catalina made the first sighting of the Ryuju task force. At 12:20, Ryujo launched 6 Kate bombers and 15 Zero fighters to bomb and strafe Henderson Field. With no confirmation of the presence or location of other Japanese carriers, at 13:40 Fletcher launched a strike of 38 aircraft from Saratoga to attack Ryujo. He kept aircraft in reserve on both U.S. carriers in case any Japanese fleet carriers were sighted. The Ryujo aircraft were detected on radar by Saratoga as they flew toward Guadalcanal, further fixing the location of their ship for the impending U.S. strike. The Ryujo strike arrived over Henderson Field at 14:23. Having been forewarned, the Wildcats of the Cactus Air Force were waiting. During the ensuing engagement, the Wildcats shot down 3 bombers and 3 Zeros at the cost of 3 of their own planes. There was no significant damage to Henderson from the Japanese attack. Almost simultaneous with the raid on Henderson, a Japanese scout plane sighted the U.S. carriers. Although the plane was shot down, its report was transmitted in time, and Nagumo immediately ordered his strike aircraft launched from Shokaku and Zuikaku. The first wave of attackers consisted of 27 dive bombers and 15 Zeros. At about the same time, 2 American scout planes finally sighted the main Japanese force, which included the 2 fleet carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku. Before leaving the area, the 2 scout planes attacked Shokaku, causing negligible damage. The Saratoga and Enterprise Strike Force arrived and attacked Ryujo. After their bombing runs, they departed, leaving Ryujo a mass of flames and stuck, cruising in a circle. Several B-17s attacked the crippled Ryujo but caused no additional damage. The crew abandoned the heavily damaged carrier at nightfall, and she sank soon afterwards. The Japanese strike force eventually located the American carriers. At 16:29, Val dive bombers began their attack. They first focused on Saratoga but were driven off. They then turned their attention to Enterprise. In less than 2 minutes, they managed to plant 3 bombs on her flight deck. Here is a photo of a Val dive bomber crashing after being hit by Enterprise anti-aircraft fire. The first bomb ever to strike the Enterprise did so at 16:44. The delayed action bomb angled into the teak flight deck at the forward starboard corner of the after elevator and penetrated through 3 steel decks before detonating. The entire ship shook from the blast, which knocked hundreds of sailors and Marines from their feet. The ship settled on a minor starboard list as fires broke out. The second bomb followed 30 seconds later. It struck only 11 feet from the first bomb and detonated on contact on the starboard edge of the flight deck. A third diving valve was hit by anti-aircraft fire and blew apart, but not before releasing its bomb, which glided toward the flight deck. At 16:46, it struck the after elevator and detonated on impact. Photographer's mate third class Robert Reed, one of 3 photographers filming the attack, was standing tall in an exposed vantage point on the island as he followed the third bomb in his viewfinder all the way to impact. Reed got this superb shot, but shrapnel from the blast killed him. Here is a brief video of the attack and the second and third bomb hits. Note the crew initially running toward the aft deck only to turn around when they spot the third incoming bomb. Battleship North Carolina, providing escort for Enterprise, was attacked at 16:45 by 3 valves that dove on her head-on. 2 bombs missed to port and a third missed to starboard. North Carolina shot down 2 of the planes as they recovered from their dives, but the third got away. Although Enterprise was heavily damaged and on fire, her damage control teams were able to make sufficient repairs for the ship to resume flight operations at 17:46, only 1 hour after the engagement ended. Events would prove that American damage control teams were far better than their Japanese counterparts at damage control. The Japanese lost ships that, had she had better firefighting capabilities, should have survived. The Enterprise Air Group was quickly turned around and flown off to Wasp, Saratoga, and Henderson Field. After absorbing the brunt of the U.S. carrier strikes and seeing one of his 2 large carriers damaged, Nagumo decided he had had enough. He ordered a withdrawal to Truk. This left Tanaka and his transports without adequate air cover. Fletcher, also a bit bloodied in the engagement, also retired his carriers south. On the morning of August 25th, after a PBY located Tanaka's transports, now about 150 miles north of Guadalcanal, the Cactus Air Force and planes from Enterprise, having landed at Henderson, pounced on the unescorted ships. They strafed the transports and worked over Tanaka's flagship, Jinsu. 1 destroyer and 1 transport were sunk. Tanaka's flagship was damaged and Tanaka was slightly injured. The surviving ships retired to the Japanese base in the Shortlands. With their traditional invasion convoys unable to land by day in the face of American air attacks and too slow to sneak in and out by night, Yamamoto abandoned sending reinforcements via troop transports altogether. Yamamoto's chief of staff, Vice Admiral Matome Ugate, wrote, "It is apparent that landing on Guadalcanal by transports is hopeless unless the enemy planes are wiped out." A new way to bring troops to the embattled island would have to be found. Tanaka would be asked to repeat his exploits delivering the Ichiki detachment again and again, using not slow transports but swift destroyers and other fast combatants to ferry the IJA south. This would be the nightly runs of the Tokyo Express down from Rabaul through the slot. The Japanese Navy would now try to reinforce the Army on Guadalcanal with fast nightly destroyer convoys down the slot. The drop-off would usually be at Tassafaronga. Through piecemeal assembly, the Japanese had at last brought in enough men to undertake their first general counteroffensive on Guadalcanal, scheduled for mid-September. Bomb-damaged Enterprise steamed back to Pearl Harbor for repairs. That left only 2 carriers, Saratoga and Wasp, left in the South Pacific to provide air cover for the convoys to Guadalcanal. The 2 American carriers remained on station in their usual position, 220 miles southeast of Guadalcanal, flying their planes in protection of convoys traveling from Espiritu Santo to Guadalcanal. A 3rd carrier, USS Hornet, CV-8, was underway south from Pearl Harbor. She arrived in the theater on August 29th. Because of the submarine threat, the carrier task force made a practice of steaming at just 13 knots to optimize the efficiency of the sonar gear on their escort destroyers. But the slow speed increased the ability of submarines to intercept and target them. It was a trade-off, but a risky one. This is a map of the Eastern Solomons with San Cristobal at the southeasternmost end of the archipelago. On August 31st, Commander Minoru Yogota, captain of the submarine I-26, stalked the Saratoga east of San Cristobal. I-26 fired a torpedo at the unsuspecting carrier. Shortly after 0700, the Saratoga shook violently when the torpedo struck just aft of the island on the starboard side. The resulting explosion left 12 wounded, including Admiral Fletcher, who sustained a head wound that would make him the highest-ranking U.S. naval officer to date to receive the Purple Heart. Saratoga was soon dead in the water. USS Minneapolis took her under tow, bringing her along at 7 knots. Saratoga would be out of action, undergoing repairs for 3 months. 24 of Saratoga's planes eventually flew to Henderson Field to augment the Cactus Air Force. With Saratoga out of action for 3 months, Admiral King had had enough of Fletcher's overly cautious command style. He returned to Pearl Harbor with Saratoga and was relieved of command of the carrier task force. He was replaced by Admiral Lee Noyes. In the weeks ahead, the momentum of attack and defense would swing daily. The Americans commanded the skies and seas by day, and the Japanese regained them by night. The Tokyo Express continued to deliver IJA troops to Guadalcanal piecemeal. This did not go unnoticed by General Vandegrift, who alerted Admirals Turner and Gormley. He said, "It appears enemy is building up striking force by continuous small landings during darkness. Due to difficult terrain, areas are beyond range of land operations except at expense of weakened defense of airfield." Besides asking for more planes for defense, he asked for the 7th Marines to reinforce the garrison. He also suggested that destroyers and PT boats be used for night patrolling. On September 3rd, Rear Admiral Lee Noyes, Fletcher's replacement, proposed that the cruisers and destroyers of the disbanded Saratoga group be used as General Vandegrift suggested, to add muscle to the surface navy in direct support of the Marines. This was given the designation Task Force 64 and was under the temporary command of Rear Admiral Carleton Wright. Task Force 64 was made up of heavy cruiser Minneapolis, light cruisers Boise and HMS Leander, and 4 destroyers. Only surface ships could stop the Tokyo Express after dark and control the seas around Guadalcanal to prevent the IJN from reinforcing the Imperial Japanese Army. On September 11th, Admirals Turner and McCain met with General Vandegrift to plan the resistance to an expected Japanese attack that the U.S. fleet knew it could not stop. To protect his precious carriers, now down to only 2, the Wasp and the newly arrived Hornet, Admiral Gormley ordered Noyes to keep them south of Guadalcanal, away from Japanese land-based aircraft. The Marines were on their own to face the expected attack along a ridge south of Henderson Field. On September 12th and 13th, the IJA, under the command of General Kawaguchi, attacked the Marine perimeter but was thrown back with grievous losses in what would become known as the Battle of Bloody Ridge. Despite the resounding Marine victory at Bloody Ridge, the savagery and determination of the Japanese attack suggested grim things to come if the nighttime reinforcements were allowed to flow. American reinforcements were on the way. The 7th Marines, under the command of Colonel Chesty Puller, were underway from Noumea. The Wasp and the newly arrived Hornet were assigned to provide air cover to the transport force. On September 15th, the ships of the covering force turned out of the wind after Wasp recovered her combat air patrol and was making 16 knots. Japanese submarine I-19, lurking nearby, maneuvered for a torpedo shot. She placed Wasp in her periscope crosshairs, then fired a spread of 6 torpedoes. 3 of the torpedoes hit the Wasp. The remaining torpedoes targeted on the Wasp continued for another 6 or 7 miles. One hit the destroyer O'Brien, and another hit the battleship North Carolina. Fire spread throughout the carrier, and eventually she had to be scuttled with several torpedoes from USS Lansdowne. Her 26 airborne aircraft at the time landed on Hornet before she sank. The remaining 45 went down with the ship. 193 men died in the explosion, but 1,946 were taken off by escort destroyers. This is the USS North Carolina, BB-55, the lead ship of the North Carolina class of fast battleships. Built within the constraints of the Washington Naval Treaty, North Carolina's original design was limited in displacement and armament, though the United States used a clause in the Second London Naval Treaty to increase the main battery from the original armament of 12 14-inch guns to 9 16-inch guns. At 14:52, O'Brien sighted smoke coming from Wasp. As a member of the aircraft carrier Hornet's ASW screen, she made an emergency turn to the right. 2 minutes later, while accelerating and swinging right, her lookout spotted a torpedo 22 degrees forward of the port beam, 1,000 yards away. This torpedo then missed O'Brien close astern, but while her crew's attention was concentrated on it, another torpedo hit her port bow. O'Brien was able to steam under her own power to Noumea. She then started for San Francisco but continued to take on water and eventually sank at 0800 on October 19th. All crew were saved. This is a diagram illustrating the location of the torpedo impact site on North Carolina. This is a photo of North Carolina in dry dock illustrating the damage to her port side. As can be seen, the damage is not insignificant. I will continue this lecture in part 2 of the naval battles of Guadalcanal.